the problem here is the threat of escalation. You're now talking about hitting the Russian homeland. You're not talking about hitting Russian targets in territory that used to be part of Ukraine that Russia has now annexed. You're back to attacking Mother Russia. And the Russians have made it clear that they consider this to be a red line. Now, my view is these attacks are not likely to be very successful, and therefore the Russians will not retaliate in any meaningful way. I think, however, if I'm wrong, and their S-400s can't shoot down these missiles and they begin to have a real effect, that the Russians will retaliate in a serious way. And of course, the great danger is that the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, will get dragged into the war and you'll have a great power war. I mean, we've gone to great lengths, we meaning the Americans, from the beginning, not to get directly involved in the fighting. And this holds some promise of bringing us in. And that makes me very nervous. I think what happened here is that in 2022, the first year of the war, you remember the Russians attacked on February 24th, 2022. For the first year of the war, we were quite confident that we could defeat the Russians. We were confident that the Ukrainians could beat the Russians on the battlefield. And moreover, we thought that economic sanctions would do egregious damage to the Russian economy, and we would in effect bring the Russian economy to its knees. And every time we attempt to bring in a new weapon or to try a new strategy, it fails. I mean, at least it fails to redress the growing imbalance against Ukraine. So here we are today with the Ukrainians in real trouble on the battlefield, and it looks like Ukraine is going to lose the war. And not surprisingly, leaders like Macron are arguing that we ought to up the ante by hitting the Russian homeland. And again, you have to ask yourself whether you think this makes sense. Anytime two countries get into a war, you get escalation. You get escalation in terms of the goals that each side has. For example, Russia's goals in this war have escalated with the passage of time. But furthermore, in terms of weaponry and in terms of how the states fight the war, you get escalation, and you bring in new weapons, you mobilize more troops, you spin up your industrial base, you hit targets that you hadn't hit before, and the end result is that the conflict escalates. But both sides are escalating. That's what you want to keep in mind. If you're talking about Britain fighting Germany in World War I, those two sides are constantly escalating. And what you try to gain over the other side is escalation dominance. You want to think that as you go up the escalation ladder, you can dominate the other side. And the problem that we face in the West is that as we have gone up the escalation ladder with the Russians have been beating us at every turn. And we, of course, respond and do our very best to rectify the growing imbalance that attends this escalation process. But we have not been successful. But it's just very important to understand that in virtually every war that's ever been fought, the means of fighting that war, as well as the goals, escalate. I think we'd be better off. I think we would be better off if we had sent more weaponry immediately to Ukraine, let's say in 2022 or early 2023. We hadn't waited so long, for example, to send them ATACMS. But I don't think it would have mattered. I think the only way we really could have beaten the Russians is if we had gotten involved in the fight. But that was not going to happen because we don't want a great power war, especially when both of those great powers, and here we're talking about the United States and Russia, have thousands of nuclear warheads. So the Biden administration has wisely tried to avoid a war. But I think, Freddie, if you don't put Western ground forces into the fight, there's no way that the Ukrainians can defeat the Russians. The fact is that there are many more Russian people than there are Ukrainian people, and therefore the Russians can build a much larger military in terms of personnel. And when you look at the Russian ability to produce weaponry, it far outstrips Ukraine's ability, and indeed it outstrips the West's ability to provide weaponry. So what you have taking place in Ukraine at this point in time is a fight between two sides where one side is badly outnumbered, not only in terms of number of soldiers, but also in terms of the weaponry that's available on each side. And the end result is that the Ukrainians are losing. And there's really nothing that we can do to fix this situation. I don't believe that even if we implement Macron's idea that it's going to make much difference. I think the Western objective takes two forms, and they're closely related. One is to stymie the Russians on the battlefield. In other words, do everything we can to prevent the Russians from gaining more territory. And then maybe in 2025 or 2026, we will have spun up the industrial bases in the West to the point where we can get the Ukrainians sufficient weaponry so that they can go back on the offensive or launch another counteroffensive and succeed this time. Some people still believe that. But the alternative, which is that goes like this. We stymie the Russians on the battlefield. We force them to go to the negotiating table, and we get the best deal possible for the Ukrainians. I think that's the most plausible goal that you can find Western spokesmen articulating these days. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether you think that's plausible. I mean, Putin, this is very hard to say in the West because Putin is usually portrayed as the second coming of Adolf Hitler. But as Russian elites, foreign policy elites go, he is not that hawkish. So one could argue that you'll easily get somebody who is more hardline, more hawkish, more willing to play hardball with the Ukrainians than Putin has been. But I think it's extremely unlikely, almost impossible to imagine that you would get some leader who would move to immediately end the war on terms that were favorable to the Ukraine and to the West. I just don't think that's going to happen. Getting rid of Putin is not going to have a significant effect on the outcome of this war. Let's assume that the war in Ukraine settles down, the shooting stops for all intents and purposes, and you get a frozen conflict. There are at least 5 potential flashpoints where the war could break out again. One is control of the Black Sea. 2 is Moldova. 3 is Belarus. 4 is the Baltic Sea, where you see a lot of activity going on. And 5 is the Arctic, where you also see a lot of activity going on. You want to understand that up in the Arctic, there are 8 countries that are physically located up there. 7 of them are NATO countries. The other is Russia. And with the ice melting and all of the consequences that fall from that, there is huge potential there. So I've just pointed out to you 5 potential flashpoints that don't include Georgia, which is what you were talking about. So you can see that there is all sorts of ways that if you get a cold peace at some point, it soon thereafter turns into another hot war because of these potential flashpoints and the fact that the West and Ukraine will never accept a Russian victory. And therefore, the West and Ukraine will go to great lengths to undermine Russia's position in Ukraine and at all those flashpoints that we just talked about. And of course, the Russians will go to great lengths to cause trouble in Europe and to cause trouble in terms of transatlantic relations. So I think for as far as the eye can see, you're going to have significant potential for conflict beyond Ukraine once you settle the conflict in Ukraine. And who knows when that conflict is going to be settled? Who knows when you're going to get a cold peace? So my guess is I'll be well into my 80s and we'll still be talking about these. I want to make it clear before I give you my view on these color revolutions that I am deeply thankful that I live in a liberal democracy. I'm deeply thankful that I was born in the United States. So I recognize that it has its flaws. Okay, but the idea that the United States of America and its allies can go around the world interfering in the domestic politics of other countries and in good part trying to shape in profound ways what those polities look like is a prescription for disaster. You want to understand that the most powerful political ideology on the planet is nationalism. We live in a world of nation states, and nationalism privileges concepts like sovereignty and self-determination. People don't want other countries coming into their country and trying to influence their politics. Look at the United States of America. The United States of America is deeply upset at the slightest hint that any Russian or any Chinese leader is interfering in our political process. We do not like that. Our view is that our political process is ours alone, and nobody from outside is allowed to interfere in it. I fully support that view. But if you think about it, that should mean that the United States should stay out of the business of trying to shape or interfere in the politics of other countries. But we do that all the time. We think we have a right and the responsibility to turn countries all across the planet into liberal democracies, to make them look like us. And this has got us into unending trouble. The Russians fear a color revolution in Moscow. The Chinese don't want to be turned into a liberal democracy. Liberalism is an ideology that is premised on the assumption that people cannot agree about first principles. And what you try to do in a liberal society is you try to give people the opportunity to live their life according to their own principles. And at the same time, you promote tolerance. You accept difference and you promote tolerance. But the United States and its European allies have gotten to the point where they think that they have the magic formula. They have the approved solution for how to run one's political system. And therefore, they have the right to intervene in the politics of other countries. This is a fundamentally illiberal way of executing a foreign policy because there's no tolerance of difference. If a country wants to have an autocratic system and that country is happy with the autocratic system, they don't like liberalism, that's their business. And we should leave them alone to lead, to put in place a system that they're happy with. But we can't do that because, again, we don't tolerate difference. We think there is an approved solution, which is liberal democracy. I don't like the word imperialistic because it reminds me of, the days when the British and the French and others had these empires, but you could call it imperialistic. One assumption is that if you facilitate social change and you get more liberal democracies, and you get rid of autocracies, that works in your strategic interest. It's a good thing. I don't think that is true. I mean, I'm going to make it clear. I don't think that promoting democracy at the end of a rifle barrel works, but let's assume that it does work. The belief, again, is that this is in our strategic interest because those liberal democracies will align with us, and authoritarian states will not. Anybody who looks at the history of American foreign policy quickly comes to understand that we have a rich history of overthrowing democracies around the world. Iran, 1953, Guatemala, 1954, Chile, 1973. I mean, the United States has overthrown many democracies. And at the same time, we've been able to live comfortably with autocracies all around the world. Saudi Arabia is the most important case. So the idea that liberal democracies automatically become allies and autocracies are enemies is an argument that I don't think you can make. So I don't even think there's any strategic value to this foolish policy of trying to interfere in the politics of other countries. I think one of the reasons they're so effective is because we are so ineffective. I mean, if you look at what the West is doing, it's really quite shocking, the extent to which we collectively are shooting ourselves in the foot. I blame the Americans more than I do the Europeans for this problem, because the Americans are in the driver's seat and the Americans have promoted a number of remarkably foolish policies. By the way, as you know, my argument on the causes of the Ukraine war is that it was the decision in April 2008 to expand NATO into Ukraine that precipitated this present war. I would note that in April 2008, at the Bucharest summit, the NATO summit in Bucharest in April 2008, it was the Americans, George W. Bush, who was pushing hard to bring Ukraine into NATO, and the Europeans, in particular Angela Merkel, who was the head of Germany at the time, and Nicolas Sarkozy, who was the head of France at the time, they were deeply opposed. They thought it was a terrible idea. So the Europeans were right, the Americans were wrong. But unfortunately, the Europeans followed the American lead, and we are where we are today. But I think we would have been better off if the Europeans had prevailed and prevented us from pursuing this crazy idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO. But the Americans are in the driver's seat here, and the Americans are not doing very well when it comes to formulating and executing foreign policy. Are you willing to fight World War III with nuclear weapons to preserve Ukraine's territorial integrity? That's the question here. I'm not. I think that it's just a fight that nobody in their right mind would want to have. I think what we should have done is we should have allowed Ukraine to keep its nuclear weapons. As you know well, I was probably the only person in the West who argued, I did this in 1993 in an article in Foreign Affairs, that Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons. That's point one. And point two is I think we should not have pursued this policy of bringing Ukraine into NATO. I think it was one of the most important decisions that has been made since the Cold War ended. And it was a disastrous decision because it led to this war, which is going to have negative consequences of all sorts for a long time to come.